Hello, everybody. Good to be back. Let's see, I was off last week, but we're back on this week. And just so you'll know, Jared, my old friend, is now doing the recording, and it's good to work with him. It's good to see him. And we're glad that we can be back in the book of Mark. We're in chapter 7 still. We've been in chapter 7 for a long time, I know, but we're at the last two verses of chapter 7, and I'm going to read that whole story, the whole part of the story, but we're going to just cover the last two verses today. And let me think if I have anything to tell you otherwise. No, I don't think so. No, if I have any gossip, I'll give it to you next week, okay? That'll be fine. So let me pray for us, and then we'll get rocking here. Lord, we're thankful that we can look into your word. Pray that everything that I say today will be honoring to you, that this passage will speak to your heart and give a clearer picture of your Son and his ministry on earth in a way that you would want it to be said, and that we will come away, I would say, honoring you more than when we started. That's my prayer, Lord. And so thank you for your presence with us now. I pray in Jesus' name. All righty, we're going to jump right in. I'm going to read this whole passage. I know we've covered the whole thing, but let's start in verse 31, and then we'll read to the end, and then we'll jump in. This is Jesus heals a deaf man, as it's titled in the NLT, and it says, Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. And a deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. And Jesus led him away from the crowd so that they could be alone. And he put his fingers into the man's ears, then spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means be opened. Instantly the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. Now we're getting into the verses that we'll be talking about today. It's Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone. But the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. And they were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. Now, right at verse 36, we bounce into what is something that runs through the whole of the book of Mark. We're confronted with as what's titled in all the theological worlds as the Messianic secret. Now, I know that this idea of the Messianic secret runs all the way through the book of Mark. And what it is that Jesus is constantly telling people not to tell them who he is, or not to tell them what he's done, or not to, and it's like they call it, since he's the Messiah, they call it his secret about being the Messiah. Now, a lot of scholars really major on this, and in fact, I think they talk about it so much that they forget what the book's about. They're more interested in discussing the Messianic secret. I have come to the conclusion, though, that this space that we're talking about now and all the others when Jesus says, don't tell anybody what I said, or don't tell anybody who I am, or something like that, that each one of those individual moments, Jesus does this for a very good reason, and it has nothing to do with the fact that he has some sort of overarching concern about people knowing who he is or not talking about him. I think each time he does it, there is something specific in the moment, and there was specific something in the moment here for him to say, well, don't talk about this. Don't tell anybody about this. Now, some people say, and you'll hear scholars say this, that he tells people not to talk about him because he knows the more he tells them not to talk about him, they'll talk about him. And that's, well, actually, Alan Cole, who's one of the top scholars in the book of Mark, called it, and I think this is funny, he calls it cheap jack psychology. I don't even know what cheap jack is, but apparently it must have meant a lot to him because he put it in his commentary. The truth is that Jesus, not wanting people to talk about him, so that they will talk about him, is exactly the opposite. It's so inconsistent with the way that Jesus is anyway, with his messages, and I would say his methods for spreading the truth. Jesus is not particularly interested in keeping people, I would say, silent so that they will disobey him. That just makes no sense. And there's a good reason right here for what Jesus does, why he says to them, don't talk about this, don't tell people this. And here's the reason. And the Greek is really strong. It's really strong. And it makes it clear. The Greek in verse 36 actually reads like this. It goes, and he ordered them that no one should tell. But as much as he ordered them, they more exceedingly proclaimed. Now, there are a couple of really important aspects to that sentence in the Greek that give us deeper insight into what was going on here. First, Jesus ordering them or commanding them. Now, when it says them, it's got to be the crowd that brought this man to him, the crowd that had gathered. They're all just amazed, and he's talking to the larger group now. And I can't imagine that if I'd seen this happen, I'd not want to talk about it. But he says it's twice. He uses a Greek word in this sentence. The word is diastello. That's the root verb. Diastello does not mean to suggest or ask. It doesn't mean anything like that. It doesn't even mean to gently try to persuade or, no, this is like, it's a charge. It's like what people say when they command people to go do something. It's as strong a word as we have in Greek to order somebody around. And this shows how strongly Jesus meant for the people to listen to his command. There's an awful lot of talk about the actual form of this verb too, and it's in the imperfect. And I'm going to talk about imperfects in a few moments, but it's an imperfect form, which means it's something that happened in the past, but it's not a closed event. In fact, when you get into imperfects, it is like something that was a circumstance that went on and on. So that when Mark chooses an imperfect verb here, he's actually saying that Jesus did this a lot, that commanded them a whole bunch. He meant for them to listen to his command. It's not a suggestion. He is giving them marching orders. Don't say anything about this. And twice Mark tells us that Jesus firmly said it. They shouldn't tell what happened. Now, why? Well, remember this deaf man, he was deaf, he'd become deaf, and he had a speech impediment that made it impossible for him to be understood. So Jesus had taken him away from the crowd, and if you recall from the other classes, that he took him away from the crowd so that he could he could focus right on this man, and this man could focus on him. He can't hear what Jesus is saying, and he can't ask him any questions. And so what Jesus does is he does hand things, and he spits on his fingers and all this stuff. And in the other class, we talked about all this. But the point is that he wants to make sure that the man that he's dealing with knows exactly what Jesus is up to. The problem is that when Jesus is doing all this physical stuff and this verbal stuff, that it can look like magical abracadabra stuff. What Jesus did not want was he didn't want people to end up at the end of all of this thinking, well, if we do this, we act like this, and we say this, we can heal deaf people too, because the gods or God must be listening to this man because he's figured out the pattern. And Jesus doesn't want that to have anything to do with it. And so what he tells the people is, don't talk about this. Let's just keep it to ourselves. This is a miracle for this man, but let's not go spreading it around that I did this and I did that, and I spit on my fingers and I stuck them in his ears and all that stuff. Because if you get around to it, everybody else who wasn't there is going to think, oh, there's a magic man and he's got the potion, or he's got the the jargon down to do it. And that's not what Jesus wanted. In fact, what he wanted was he preferred that the only way that this thing was going to be known was when this guy circulated around in his world, and people who had known him to first off be deaf, and then to have a speech impediment where he could not speak and be understood, but then he shows up hearing and speaking. People are going to be amazed, and they're going to say, what happened to you? And this man can go, well, I met Jesus, and he did this for me. Now, I don't know whether the guy, and from the last classes, you may remember, we don't know for sure if the guy came out and was the first things that he did was run over to his friends and say, Jesus did this, and he stuck his fingers in my ear, and he spit on his fingers, and he touched my tongue, and he said this word in Aramaic, and all that stuff. We don't know that. But what is really important to this man is that he met Jesus, and Jesus healed him. That's how Jesus wanted this story to be spread. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that Jesus is trying to stop everybody from going off on the pattern. But Mark lets us know that this miracle was it was too overwhelming to be kept a secret. In fact, in the Greek, Mark makes a comparison between Jesus' ordering and the way that Jesus tells them not to talk about it, and the fervor with which the people tell the story to other people. In fact, the way he describes the ongoing report of Jesus' healing is consistently strong in the Greek. Again, imperfects, strong language. To say, as it does in the NLT, it says, the more they, let's see, he said, let me read it right. He said, but the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. Can I just say that's an understatement? I don't know what the translators were thinking when they got there. It's more like this. It's the more they exceedingly proclaimed. And here, Mark uses a really interesting word to say what they were doing. He uses the word caruso, which is a verb that initially meant to speak out loudly about something. The main point of this word was used when somebody was like in the marketplace and they were going to give out a big bunch of news for public consumption. It's like to herald something or proclaim something or order something publicly. And the word itself, this verb, eventually, and I'd be willing to bet that by the time that Mark wrote this, the word had already shifted in meaning, and what it became was the word that we use to describe the preaching of the gospel. In fact, we still have the word. The verb in the Greek is caruso. In English, it's become the word kerygma. And kerygma is like the word that second-year Masters of Divinity students all use to talk about preaching. You know, I have the kerygma of the word, and you take a course on kerygma, which is just really preaching, proclaiming the good news. But that's the word that's here. And the exceedingly word, it's like over the top. It means like in too much abundance. It's way beyond what you need to. They proclaimed what happened way beyond what they needed to. It wasn't that they just spread it more than they should have. It's like, oh, it's terrible the way they went crazy. The point is that these two things sit in opposition to each other. Jesus is saying, don't tell, and then they tell. And this proclamation of Jesus' healing must have just spread like wildfire. Because why? Because everybody that was there went crazy talking about it. It's such a strong word there. It goes beyond anything necessary. So what we're left with is the more that Jesus says don't do it, the more they do it. Now, of course, that's why these other people go, well, he only did that because he knew they'd do this. And that's crazy. I'm going to read you a quote from R.T. France, who's like one of the top scholars on Mark, and it's got to do with the imperfects. I'm just going to read it to you, and I know that it's going to sound silly, probably, but it meant something to me. He goes, the imperfects, distiletto, and ekerusan, which I probably mispronounced both of those, but suggest a protracted appeal for silence and an equally protracted disobedience. The astonishment of the crowd here is more dramatically expressed by the use of a hapex legomenon, which I just love that, which means, and here's a point of what he just said. First, he uses a tense to say that everything is not just an event that happened, but like this was going on. It was a circumstance where they had to go back and forth. Like it wasn't just something where Jesus went like this and then they all yelled out. No, this went on and on. And when he says he uses a hapex legomenon, that's cool, because what it means is he uses a word that we only find one time in the New Testament, which means that it's not a word that just naturally runs in the writing of things like this. And Mark goes out of his way to find a Greek word that is so unusual that it expresses how profoundly people wanted to talk about Jesus. Now, this suggests that the healing of this deaf and dumb man was a matter of tremendous amazement. Now, saying this, how do I say that? It's like the change in this man's life is beyond imagination. Of course they want to talk about it. And this is like a picture of the way that the good news from Jesus is supposed to function in the world. That which happens to us when we meet Jesus, and he looks us in the eye and he speaks to us. Boom. What happens is the change is so grand that we should be so moved. We can't help but talk about it in some manner. Anyway, not to get too devotional there. Now, the response of the crowd can be one of two ways, taken one of two ways. If you recall, we talked about we're unsure. I'm pretty sure this is a Gentile crowd. He's in Decapolis, it says. And so this would be the same people who the last time they were around him, Jesus drove a bunch of demons out of a guy, and then about 2 or 3,000 pigs all drowned. They're scared to death of this guy, and he's shown back up. And if they're a Gentile crowd, the Gentiles would have responded to Jesus with great excitement because he brought healing powers that actually touched one of their own, and not just this man who had the demons, but he was a Jewish healer who was willing to use his gifts on everybody. And it would easily take away the fear that they had of him because of what he did the last time. Because if you remember, when he drove those demons out of a legion and they all went into the pigs and they fell over the cliff and died, this same crowd came to him and said, "Get out, please, go away, go away." And he comes back and he does this. The story changes. If they're Gentiles. Now, if the other people that think that he came down into Decapolis and went back across the lake and he's in a Jewish territory, that crowd would have a deep sense that there's something messianic about this guy. There's somebody who's like a Messiah. And I'm just going to read you. I got to look it up here, but it's in Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. And in Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, these verses are part of the primary bit of Isaiah that everybody in the first century, every Jewish person, was leaning on to tell them what the Messiah would look like. And it says, "And when he comes, he will open the eyes of the blind and unplug the ears of the deaf. The lame will leap like a deer, and those who cannot speak will sing for joy." the way, and if you recall, the way that he describes the man who could not speak, he uses the exact same noun out of the Septuagint that describes in Isaiah those who cannot speak. The only 2 times this word is used in the Bible anywhere, and it's in these 2 stories. Mark is certainly connecting these. So I'm sure that if this was in a Jewish crowd, which I don't think it was, but the disciples were there, and this would have come to their mind. This is a man who does what? He unplugs the ears of the deaf, and he makes it possible for those who can't speak to speak. Now, what the crowd says in verse 37 is really important. They say, they were amazed and said again and again, repeatedly, exceedingly, everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. Well, for Gentiles, this would be just a reference that Jesus does everything well, that his healing is fully realized. The deaf hear, and they hear as well as anybody can hear. And then he says that he makes it possible for people to speak. Jesus, his healing of this man's speech, his speech is as good as anybody can talk. This is all okay. This is all done well, they say. And the reason that they give him such high praise is that they lived in a world of multiple healers. And most of the time, these magicians who came in and said they could heal, their healing was only partially there. Or they said, if you've got it, but it'll show up later, or something like that. They were constantly trying to protect their butts, I suppose, as healers, because they couldn't pull it off fully. And yet, boom, Jesus does one thing, and he does what? He gets high praise because everything he did was fully realized. And it makes sense that a Gentile crowd would spread this news because it sits well with all of them, particularly since they were all afraid of Jesus to begin with. It makes sense to me. But if this is a Jewish crowd, and if those in the crowd understand the Jewish traditional language about prophets and about God himself, they're going to know that when you say that he does all things well, or everything is done well, this language connects right up oddly. I know this is going to sound weird, but it connects right up with Genesis 1, where it says that everything that God did was what? It was good. Kalos. Same word, both places. Everything that he did is categorized here as being good in the sense of God's initial creation. This language hints at a connection between the work of Jesus and the good works of God. The NLT goes in the direction of this being a Gentile crowd. Jesus does wonderful things. Everything he does is wonderful, including healing the deaf and the dumb. This works. I think that works. But the other one works really well too. That the works of Jesus are the works of God. And when Jesus acts, he does everything what? That is good. And this word is just like, boom, it's like so big. And it's talking about so many things. Good, they are wonderful. Think of how different this man's life was with the new creation of his ears and his tongue. It's good. Here's a man whose life is altered immensely by what? Coming face to face with whom? God. This is what we're talking about now. This takes us back to the primary question of the entire section of Mark that we're in. And that question is what? And you all know it. It's, who is this man? Well, who is this man? He's a man who can heal the deaf and give speech to the dumb. But it's even bigger than that. Not only can he do that, but everything that he does is done in a manner that appears to be identical to God's creative capacity. It's powerful enough to write all of them. This is what touched my heart about this story. What Jesus does in this moment is he rights all the wrongs that come with sin's entrance into a world, especially as it hits those people who are fully innocent. Everybody in this man's life would have said there's some sin in his life or his parents' life or something that made him deaf and made it so that he couldn't talk. And yet Jesus' actions negates all of that and does what? It gives the innocent life. This is a moment of renewal in more ways than just simply the ability to hear and speak. It's the return of a man to his community. It is the reversal of all the shame that was certainly heaped upon him. It's evidence of the mission of God in the world to bring what? New creation to the world. This is what's predicted in those Isaiah passages that I read earlier. And so who is this man? He's the Messiah. He's the one who fulfills all of Messiah's vision. He came to set people free from everything that can hold us in bondage, whether that be spiritual or physical. That's who this man is. You never forget it. One more answer to the question of the disciples. Who is this man? This is a man who sets us free from all of the repercussions of a fallen world. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, we have just finished chapter 7, folks. Next week, I'm going to start chapter 8. There are 16 chapters, and so in who knows when we'll be done with chapter 8, but then we'll be halfway. So I just thought I'd let you know. We're moving on, and it's good to be with you, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.